Forward. The Two Types of Chameleon by Milo Yiannopoulos. I'm a smart person. Really smart, actually, and very expensively educated. But half the time, I just can't understand a bloody word Jordan Peterson says. And I've been thinking recently about why that could be. Ordinarily, I can listen to someone prattling on and quickly get to the heart of what they are trying to express. That's one of the skills you pick up as a journalist. You learn to quickly identify the core of a problem, the essence of what's being said. You learn to filter out the noise and to identify bullshitters. But with Jordan Peterson, once I've filtered out the noise, I don't find a lot left to work with. And there's another problem. He lies. When he first began to speak about me, Jordan Peterson described me as a, quote, amazing person. This was around the time he called me on the telephone, expressing sympathy for the failed assassination attempt on me in February 2017, when I was wrongly accused of supporting child rapists. He offered to do a series of on-camera interviews with me. He described me publicly and correctly as a, quote, trickster figure, explaining that trickster figures emerge in times of crisis, and they point out what no one wants to see, and they say things that no one will say. He continued, Milo's brave as can be, and he's unstoppable on his feet. He just amazes me. I've never seen anyone, I don't think, and I've met some pretty smart people. I've never seen anyone who can take on an onslaught of criticism and reverse it like he can. Fast forward to an onstage interview with Barry Weiss in June 2018 at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Weiss is talking about a professor who paired me with Hitler and gave us as examples of very bad things. She alleges that I, the interracially married man, am indeed a racist. To which Peterson replies, well, possibly, yeah. I haven't followed Milo that carefully. What happened? By his own definition, this is the way demagogues work, by listening to their audience and adjusting their responses accordingly. Why was Peterson suddenly going along with something he knew wasn't true and rewriting history, pretending he didn't know that much at all about someone he had on numerous occasions so intelligently explained? I realize that by asking this question, you're going to think that I'm just wounded that someone I once admired has since soured on me. But that's the thing. From the first time I heard Jordan Peterson speak, my nostrils picked up a whiff of sulfur in the air, and not just because he dresses in that awful, drab, monotonous Victoriana. In an era of social justice, we are desperate to hear people defending Western civilization, and doing so forcefully in a way that shows up the progressive left for the vacuous, parasitical bullies they are. Men, in particular, need superheroes like never before in history, although they like slightly feminized men, like the products of the Marvel Universe, so that even when immersed in their masculine fantasies, they're still the biggest dog in the room. There's nothing less intimidating or more gay than the aggressively hyper-masculine Thor, the tongue-tied and slightly dim Captain America, or Loki, the wily trickster. Likewise, by presenting himself as an avuncular, asexual, physically frail character, Peterson can be a hero to men without threatening their manhood, much in the same way my homosexuality has made me a hero to straight men. This is why Peterson has been able to bamboozle some quite clever people into thinking he is the second coming. But I have no patience for gobbledygook, and I have no faith in people who, when push comes to shove, will bend for popularity, comfort, and an easy life, rather than defend what they know to be true. Peterson's manner of speaking is designed to be fascinating. It's easy to get sucked in. He constantly defers solutions, leaving listeners to fill in the gaps and reach the ultimate conclusions themselves. And he's always hedging his own statements with phrases such as, "It's something like that." The way he speaks is designed to conjure up a rigorously precise, intellectually humble professor who doesn't want to commit wholly to a claim unless he knows he is absolutely correct. I do not find this way of speaking fascinating, though clearly I'm in the minority. I prefer plain talk. I like simple, clear, unambiguous statements of opinion. I believe in objective truth and such a thing as right and wrong. I'm never going to be satisfied by a writer who is constantly pointing to deeper solutions that are endlessly deferred. I want to know what a person really thinks. I have no idea what Jordan Peterson really thinks. And I've come to the conclusion that all this constant prevarication occurs not because he's a great teacher, eagerly hoping his charges will make the final leap of their own volition, nor is it because he's a modest, Socratic thinker. No, it's a public relations strategy deployed so he never really has to commit to saying what he means, because he doesn't really want to be understood, because, like his friends in the risible intellectual dark web, he doesn't actually like or agree with his own fan base. When Peterson is put to the test, he has an established pattern of going soft at the critical moment. Peterson's watershed was a tweet he must now bitterly regret sending because it gave the game away entirely. He said Brett Kavanaugh should accept his Supreme Court nomination and then quit. Peterson, apparently forgetting everything he knew about the feral left, claimed that this might somehow soothe the activist wing of the Democrat Party into treating the rest of us with a bit more civility. Ugh, come off it. I remember thinking to myself, Jordan Peterson, of all people, cannot possibly believe this. And no amount of thrashing around on social media afterwards, claiming he was just engaging in a thought experiment, has persuaded anyone that he was just floating an idea out there. Peterson's reaction to Kavanaugh raises questions about his attitude to and relationships with women, which I haven't seen many people discuss. There is something off about the way he talks about his daughter, though I can't work out what it is. And I note in his habit of describing the feminine as chaos and the masculine as order, a kind of incomprehension and fear of women, which makes him a very poor role model for men. It does explain his appeal to a certain kind of socially awkward, sexually confused guy who cannot relate to girls. But Peterson is just the same, so he isn't going to help these guys. There is no such thing as the chaotic feminine Peterson recognizes. She is the whore of Babylon, rather than the heavenly bride. But Jordan only sees the whore. This is a fundamental failing in his mythological structure. He doesn't see the ordering feminine, the lady as heavenly city who gives a home to her groom. Men are constantly asking feminists to be more honest about male virtue. They have to do women the same courtesy. Peterson doesn't, and can't. What really annoys everyone is how, when the going gets tough, Peterson chucks out everything he's been preaching for the past 2 years and takes the easy route. He tells his followers to read Solzhenitsyn. He says he knows and hates Marxism. But then he tweets, if confirmed, Kavanaugh should step down. With these 6 words, he revealed his true strategy in the face of the enemy: surrender and appeasement. A light knock, and this guy dents like a tin can, warping and distorting himself to evade critique. Peterson and I are sometimes compared with respect to our intellectual dexterity, and I think I understand the root of this misunderstanding. It seems to me that there are 2 types of chameleon. The first kind uses different modes, styles, fashions, media, and mannerisms to convey, to different audiences at different times, the same essential truth. His message does not change, but he is intelligent enough to know that you cannot talk to everyone the same way. These chameleons are charming, adaptable, and endlessly insightful about human nature. Politicians who reflexively modify their accents in different parts of the country are of this type. These chameleons are sometimes wrongly thought of as insubstantial by people with no imagination, subtlety, or grasp of humor or artistic license. I have always aspired to be such a thinker and performer, which is why I tell fat jokes and call people cunts during lectures about religion and political philosophy. I enjoy blending highbrow analysis with sermo humilis in unexpected and uncomfortable ways, and I don't mind being misunderstood by dullards or misrepresented by snakes. It's the price of being someone as comfortable with billionaires as he is with steelworkers. But then there's the chameleon who looks and sounds the same all the time, but who adjusts and even completely subverts his own ideology depending on the audience. Jordan Peterson's grim, predictable wardrobe, his effete speaking style, His pained expressions and his eternally somber aspect give the superficial impression of gravity and consistency. But when you look at what he says, you find a coiled and poisonous serpent beneath the dusty carapace. Asked to define something, anything, Peterson dodges. The author of this book, Fox Day, has suggested that this is the mark of a charlatan. But I see something even worse. There is a theological horror in Peterson's starting position. He believes that life is suffering, which holds only if you define reality purely in terms of pleasure and pain. This is an Enlightenment reduction of truth to what can be proven empirically, carving the world up into claims of value and claims of fact, relegating religion to the realm of the unknowable. As a Catholic, I believe in the objective truth of God's existence and love. But for Peterson, religion lives in the world of subjective feelings, divorced from anything besides the relief of suffering. It thus becomes the opiate of the masses. Meaning is entirely subjective for Peterson because he accepts this Enlightenment distinction. That's why he talks about religion as though it were a sort of psychic medicine. And critically, that's why he's a Marxist, even though he claims to hate Marxism. He believes in the end to which Marx tends, and only hates Marx because Marxism fails to get us there. This is why Peterson's discussions with Sam Harris are so boring. He can't get past trying to make Harris agree that evil is the same as suffering. Marxism is the unkeepable promise of a release from suffering by earthly means, and this is Peterson's entire project. When he's limiting himself to Tony Robbins-style self-help, Peterson's prescriptions won't do you any harm. Cleaning your room isn't a good habit to get into because there's something intrinsically good about clean rooms. Rather, good practical habits grow into good personal discipline. Most skills develop by increment, not leap. But he can't be trusted to talk about anything that matters. When Peterson reads "When You Wish Upon a Star" as a way of focusing on a transcendent goal, he isn't exactly wrong, but he does not himself believe in the reality of the transcendent. He just wants to fix your mood in the here and now, like a hit of sugar or a compliment from an attractive stranger. He is a line of coke, masquerading as the Eucharist. As Owen Benjamin first noticed, Jordan Peterson has entered what we might call a late decadent phase, in which the bauble of representation by CAA and the promise of stardom act as crucibles, hastening his exposure as Antichrist and diluting his speech and opinions so they are more acceptable to his enemies. He has handed responsibility for his future over to people dedicated to his annihilation. In doing so, he risks us all. Peterson's position and fandom must become untenable. As he himself puts it in his 12 Rules for Life, if the gap between pretense and reality goes unmentioned, it will widen, you will fall into it, and the consequences will not be good. Ignored reality manifests itself in an abyss of confusion and suffering." End quote. If this ruthless careerism comes as a surprise, perhaps you haven't been paying attention. Do you remember Faith Goldy? She was booted from a conference lineup by Peterson, who unpersoned his fellow panelist with a classic mealy-mouthed non-explanation, insinuating that she was too hot a property. Goldy has made some mistakes, appearing on podcasts with unsavory characters. I would not personally appear on the Daily Stormer podcast, especially not in the wake of Charlottesville, but she is not, as far as I can tell, a racist. Peterson himself said, "I don't believe she's a reprehensible person," but he went ahead and killed her career anyway. Peterson made her untouchable, persona non grata, and he did so knowing what the consequences to her life would be. After all, if you're too much for the quote-unquote extreme Jordan Peterson, you must really be beyond the pale, right? Goldy has since been physically assaulted by protesters as Canadian media companies sat back and filmed. She has been scrubbed from every online payment service, making it impossible for her to support herself. Ads for her Toronto mayoral campaign have been banned by Rogers and Bell Media. Her life has been destroyed by Jordan Peterson. She is shouted at in public and assaulted in the street while he tours the world, showered in riches and acclaim. Peter denied Jesus, just as his nominative descendant Peterson has denied me and others. Both Peters did it for the same reason: fear and self-interest. I don't think it's a coincidence that Peterson denied me in Aspen in front of what must have been the wealthiest audience he'd ever addressed. And I don't think it's a coincidence that his greatest tell to date happened in relation to a Supreme Court announcement, the most important political event outside of a presidential election. When the chips are down, Peterson goes splat. I can take inconsistency in people. I am myself a contradictory figure. The pop stars and writers I admire are all complex people, and I can take a degree of studied ambiguity. I see and appreciate the strategy in remaining enigmatic and mysterious, even if it's not to my personal taste in a public intellectual. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy satire or subtlety, obviously, just that I like them in someone who is also capable, when called upon, of calling a spade a spade. I don't even mind people whose positions and language soften when the establishment offers them fame and wealth in exchange for spaying them. I think it's craven, but I understand now as a happily married man why someone might pick comfort and family security over being wholly true to themselves. What I can't tolerate in a public figure is hypocritical disloyalty, the sort of cowardice that hurls allies to the ground in violation of every principle a person has previously stated and in defiance of the very reason the speaker has a platform in the first place. I find Jordan Peterson guilty of this charge, and I cannot excuse it. If you betray one friend, you will later betray others. If you sacrifice one principle, you cannot be trusted not to sacrifice them all. I have paid a terrible professional and personal price for remaining true to my beliefs and refusing to back down or apologize, unlike some diminutive people I could mention, unsurprisingly, friends with Peterson, who condemned Donald Trump before unctuously praising him a year later for money and popularity. So have other friends of mine in media, politics, and academia who know where the slippery slope of moral compromise leads and who refuse to be soiled by it. So I know what it looks like and what it takes out of a person when he sticks to his guns, no matter the cost. I'm inspired by the fortitude of Pamela Geller and Tommy Robinson, and lucky to call them friends. I am not inspired by Jordan Peterson. Quite aside from the dark, miserable heart of his philosophy, Peterson has repeatedly betrayed everything he says he believes in for his own expediency, convenience, and profit at precisely the time it matters most, and then lied about it all. And that's why I'm glad Vox Day has written this book. When it really comes down to it, Peterson preaches and practices capitulation to the violent delights of feminine chaos. He isn't prepared to accept the costs of victory or the burden of heroism. He does not hold fast to fact, reason, and logic in the face of the maelstrom because he does not possess the heroic, manly virtue of courage. The orderliness, certainty, and strength of manhood isn't enough to quiet his troubled soul. At a minute to midnight, with the hounds on his tail, Peterson chooses to believe all women. Milo Yiannopoulos, Miami, Florida, October 2018. Introduction: The Meandering Fog of Meaning. Quote, "Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby, you can be the director of the opponent's fate." End quote. Sun Tzu. I initially paid no attention to Jordan Peterson's rise. To the extent that I thought of him at all, I assumed he was merely another self-help guru, in much the same mode as Deepak Chopra or Tony Robbins, just to name two massively successful self-help authors of the past. But over the last 2 years, his name kept coming up more and more often in the online circles in which I travel, mostly as a result of his seemingly staunch opposition to the social justice warriors who were the focus of 2 of my books on political philosophy, SJWs Always Lie and SJWs Always Double Down. So, like many others, I assumed that the Canadian professor was one of those rare intellectuals inclined to stand up for the uncomfortable truth, in the vein of my friends Milo Yiannopoulos, Mike Cernovich, Ivan Throne, and Stefan Molyneux, without ever actually looking into anything he was writing, saying, or doing. I neither read his work nor wrote about him at all. A single link to a pedestrian interview with him in December 2016 by Canadian journal C2C was one of the few times my blog even mentioned him prior to my first direct encounter with the greatest thinker in human history. On April 24th, 2018, Jordan Peterson published an article entitled On the So-Called Jewish Question. In it, he attacked the far right and labeled its members pathological anti-Semites and reactionary conspiracy theorists for their thought crime of offering a rational explanation for what Peterson himself admitted was the overrepresentation of Jews in positions of authority, competence, and influence. Because I happen to be a moderately well-known member of the nationalist right and the author of the 16 Points of the Nationalist Right, a number of my fellow right-wingers brought the article to my attention and asked me to take a look at it. So I did, and was extremely surprised by what I discovered in light of how I had hitherto heard only superlatives regarding the man, his intellectual integrity, and his fearless dedication to the truth. What I was astonished to observe was that Jordan Peterson didn't even bother to consider the vast majority of the relevant evidence available before leaping to what I knew was a wildly erroneous and deeply flawed conclusion. He wrote, quote, "No conspiracy. Get it? No conspiracy. Jewish people are overrepresented in positions of competence and authority because, as a group, they have a higher mean IQ. There is no evidence whatsoever that Ashkenazi Jews are overrepresented in any occupations/interests for reasons other than intelligence and the associated effects of intelligence on personality and political belief. Thus, no conspiratorial claims based on ethnic identity need to be given credence." End quote. On the so-called Jewish question. The problem was that, having been nationally syndicated twice in my youth, first by Chronicle Features and then by United Press Syndicate, I knew perfectly well that some individuals of a certain persuasion, such as Ben Shapiro, just to provide a specific name, had been systematically promoted, presumably due to their ethnic identity, at the expense of more intelligent, more successful, and more popular colleagues. In my experience, Peterson's statement was flat out wrong. For example, when Ben Shapiro and I were both writing for WorldNet Daily in the early 2000s, I was the third most read weekly columnist there, behind Pat Buchanan and Ann Coulter. Ben Shapiro, on the other hand, wasn't even in the top 10. If I recall correctly, his column readership numbers usually came in towards the bottom of the top 20 and averaged less than 1/3 of my own and 1/5 of Pat Buchanan's. But while Ann Coulter and I were both signed to the elite Universal Press Syndicate, the less discriminating Creators Syndicate not only passed over most of the WorldNet Daily columnists who are observably more popular than Ben Shapiro, they told newspaper editors that they had to take Shapiro's column if those editors wanted to run columns by other, more popular columnists syndicated by creators in their newspapers. Now, there is nothing wrong with that. I certainly would have appreciated it if UPS had done the same for me and packaged my column with Ann's in a similar manner, but the White Shoe Syndicate was above such unseemly high-pressure sales tactics. The point is, they were utilized, and there is no question that my young colleague was the inexplicable beneficiary of them. Nor was that the only time I witnessed the very ethnic nepotism that Peterson denied. What struck me even more than Peterson's false assertions was the vehemence with which he expressed his incorrect conclusions. To put it simply, the professor protested too much. That was not the only problem with his statements. As a result of having done some research into declining national IQ averages in a book that I wrote back in 2015 with John Red Eagle, I not only knew that Jordan Peterson's claim of an average Jewish IQ advantage of 10 to 15 points over the white American population was false, I also knew the original basis for the claims of an average 115 Ashkenazi IQ and the weak scientific foundation upon which they rested. Even worse for Jordan Peterson, I immediately saw that he was statistically illiterate, given that his assertion necessarily implied that all the non-Ashkenazi Jews on the planet possess a lower average IQ than African Americans. Allow me to briefly explain. The population of Israel is 74.5% Jewish, of whom 47.5% are Ashkenazi Jews, the latter being 36% of the total population. Given the average reported Israeli IQ of 95 and the average reported Jordanian IQ of 84 serving as a proxy for Arab Israelis, an average 115 IQ for Ashkenazi Jews would necessarily indicate that all the other Jews on the planet have an average IQ of 84.2, which is slightly below the average reported African American IQ of 85. Does that sound right to you? If you wish to contemplate the issue in more detail, you can read the analysis in one of the appendices. And before you leap to the erroneous conclusion that my position is somehow anti-Semitic, please note that I am not the one claiming Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews have a reported average IQ more than one standard deviation below Europeans. To top it all off, it was evident that Peterson did not realize that the original claim of very high Jewish IQ in the USA was based on a very small sample of elite Jewish elementary school children that was published in 1957 and was similar to another study of the era that reported an average 119 IQ for white Christian American children. As it happens, neither study was even remotely relevant to the average IQs of the relevant populations at the time, much less 62 years later, by the admission of Boris Levinson himself, the author of The Intelligence of Applicants for Admission to Jewish Day Schools, published in Jewish Social Studies, Volume 19, Number 3 of 4, July to October 1957. In short, the position Peterson was so vehemently defending was entirely built upon a foundation of intellectual sand. But when this was pointed out to him, in detail, by one of his readers who was familiar with my work, Peterson didn't even hesitate to double down. Even worse, he did so in an incredibly inept manner that raised serious questions about both his intellect and his integrity. His attempt to defend his earlier errors proved to be disastrous. All that raising the cutoff for high IQ from one standard deviation to 3 standard deviations accomplished was to demonstrate his mathematical inadequacy. He was off by an order of magnitude with regards to the Jewish percentage of the 145-plus IQ population in the United States, which is considerably closer to 3.7% rather than the 40.8% that Peterson has erroneously claimed. That was the point at which I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that Jordan Peterson was a charlatan, an intellectual fraud, and a wolf in sheep's clothing. An honest man, a genuine intellectual, simply does not make errors of that magnitude, then promptly proceed to make even bigger errors after being publicly called out and corrected. That's what a con man who is attempting to salvage his con does. That's what someone who is dedicated to deceiving his audience does. Now, there are no shortage of intellectual con men out there, and I don't consider myself to be the truth police. Having confirmed for myself that Jordan Peterson was little more than a Canadian version of Deepak Chopra or L. Ron Hubbard, I was perfectly ready to return to completely ignoring him, but I was unable to do so thanks to his fans. Instead of accepting my critique or even going over the various points in detail and attempting to rebut them, they attacked my intellect, my integrity, and my motivations. They accused me of jealousy, they accused me of envy, and they accused me of dishonesty, all in defense of a man who is observably lacking in any intellectual integrity at all. It was exceedingly bizarre, especially when I had done nothing more than point out a few of the obvious mistakes the man had made. So I decided to begin looking more deeply into this popular professor who is being so widely hailed as a formidable thinker, a thoughtful philosopher, a courageous defender of free speech, and a champion of young men. But almost immediately, I discovered that his reputation was at variance with his actions, as in the case of his deeply ironic decision to ban investigative journalist Faith Goldy from participating in an August 2017 event at Ryerson University called The Stifling of Free Speech on University Campuses. The event was canceled, and with Peterson's approval, Goldy was barred from participating in the rescheduled event. When he was subsequently asked about his decision in public, Peterson responded with what I eventually came to recognize was his characteristic baffle garble, the word smog he habitually uses to conceal his actual meaning. Quote, Question. I understand that Faith Goldy was removed from the original August panel because of her podcast with the controversial Daily Stormer after Charlottesville. This strategy appears to parallel the SJWs, who wish to deny platforms to conservative speakers. I want to understand why Faith Goldy was removed from the event simply for associating with identitarians, and if each of the panelists agree with that decision. Jordan Peterson. That's an excellent question. So the first thing I should say is that it's not like we're unaware of the irony. Number one, Ryerson canceled a panel about the cancellation of panels about free speech. That's irony number one. And then irony number two was that the panelists removed a speaker for arguably engaging in the act of free speech. Okay, we got that, believe me. All right, so why did we come to this decision? I sat down personally. The other people can say what they have to say. I sat down with my son and we went through Faith's interview. I know Faith. I don't believe she is a reprehensible person. I think that Charlottesville was very shocking to her, and I think that she put herself in a very difficult position, and I think some of that was brave that she went down there to cover it. However, I listened very carefully to her podcast, the one that got her in trouble, and my sense was that she didn't. She was associating with people whose views she should have questioned. It was her journalistic, responsibility to question them. She had to ask at least one hard question. At least one. 3 would have been better. You know, and I understand she had to toe a careful line. She was on the podcast. They had invited her on. It's much more difficult than you might think when you're facing people, even when you don't believe them, to be rude enough to challenge them, right? That's not so easy, especially if you're an agreeable person, and she is a rather agreeable person. But I believe she failed in her journalistic responsibility, and as a consequence of that, she became too hot a property for us, and not just for us. And well, that was the reason for the decision. That was my reasoning." End quote. Now, this was manifestly not the correct behavior of a highly principled man, or even a reasonably honest one. Jordan Peterson did something he clearly knew to be wrong. He did something he clearly knew to be hypocritical. But instead of simply owning up to his obvious failure when called out on it in public, he attempted to concoct a ridiculous ex post facto excuse to justify it. Again. He had to know that he was going to have to face the question sooner or later. He even appears to have prepared for it, and yet this response was the best that he could manage. If you watch the video, you can even see that Jordan Peterson has a reliable tell that warns the viewer when he's about to say something that he knows is not true. He also betrays another tell that indicates when he is going to, very carefully, attempt to conceal the weakness of one of his assertions or conclusions. Just watch for the repetitions and the adverbs. Once you learn to recognize them, you can identify when Jordan Peterson is trying to pull a fast one on his audience, even when you don't know what he's talking about. And the obvious question Peterson's response raises is this: according to what theory of human rights or journalism does one's own right to free speech rely upon one's correct performance of non-existent journalistic responsibilities? There is no such theory. It's a nonsensical assertion. It's classic Petersonian baffle garble. But it requires a high level of mental focus to penetrate the fog of Peterson's word salad and see what he is literally saying. After twice seeing Peterson's shameless dishonesty in action, I decided it was time to delve deeper into the man's actual work. Being a writer myself, I was aware that men express themselves differently in different media. Many eloquent speakers reveal themselves to be superficial thinkers in writing, and no few writers, myself included, are unable to express their genuinely profound thoughts in a facile manner in front of a microphone or a camera. Perhaps Peterson was much better in print than he was on video or on the internet. After all, he was the best-selling author on the planet at the time. So, I read his bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. I read his would-be magnum opus, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. I even read his contribution to the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on sustainable development, of which he was a member, Resilient People, Resilient Planet, A Future Worth Choosing. And this book is the result of what I learned from reading the 3 published works of Jordan Peterson. A word of warning, this book is necessarily more than a little esoteric. It references a number of words with which you may be unfamiliar and draws obscure connections you may not immediately recognize or that you may be initially reluctant to acknowledge, especially if you are a Jordan Peterson fan. But you can be sure of one thing. Unlike Jordan Peterson, I am not attempting to deceive, confuse, dazzle, or baffle you. Unlike Jordan Peterson, I am not attempting to change your perspective or your philosophy. Unlike Jordan Peterson, the logic I present is clear and straightforward. And unlike Jordan Peterson, I do not owe my allegiance to anything but the objective truth, as that concept has been defined in the dictionary and understood by man since the beginning of time. You need not take my word for any of this. Everything I'm writing here is based on material evidence that you can obtain, examine, and analyze for yourself. So clear your mind, set aside your assumptions and preconceptions, and prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of one of the most shameless intellectual charlatans in the history of man. Chapter 1. Enter the Charlatan. Remember, falsehoods have consequences. That's what makes them false. Dr. Jordan Peterson. Jordan B. Peterson's self-help book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, is a candidate to become Canada's best-selling book of all time. It is a #1 seller in North America and internationally. The author has 1.6 million YouTube subscribers, 904,000 Twitter followers, and a Patreon account believed to bring in over $100,000 per month in donations. He has been touring the United States in front of sold-out, adoring crowds, buying tickets for as much as $400 a seat, and has recently signed with CAA, the agency to the Hollywood elite. He is the central figure of the New York Times christened intellectual dark web, and is even rumored to have been selected to be television's next Oprah Winfrey. The rise of the soft-spoken professor of psychology and his newfound prominence as an international thought leader and a father figure to hundreds of thousands of millennials is a genuinely astonishing media phenomenon. Most of his fans first encountered Peterson online in one of his long, rambling videos. In addition to a large number of his classroom lectures, he also produces YouTube videos addressing his social and personal concerns as well as the interests of his massive online following. Others came across him by way of various media interviews, where he was seen to be addressing various social positions, such as the newly discovered moral requirement to use ungendered pronouns, or the idea that sexist payroll practices are the source of the alleged pay gap between men and women. Still others availed themselves of the various self-assessment and self-improvement services available on his website. These things made him stand out amidst a culture under assault and in upheaval. The Western nations are adulterated, and Western civilization is in decline. Young people attempting to enter the workforce struggle to find meaningful, reasonably paid employment, and they are subject to relentless competition from more directions than ever before, from subsidized discount H-1B foreign workers to off-the-books illegals and affirmative action hires of dubious quality. Not only that, but many of the jobs available appear to be more the make-work consequence of globalized malinvestment than any genuinely productive business need. After all, what does a social media specialist actually produce? Or for that matter, a project manager or a trust and safety council member? It isn't that these jobs and hundreds of others like them can't be legitimate jobs under some circumstances. It is just that there is a sense that so many of the jobs available today are useless, unnecessary, underpaid, and ultimately artificial. As frustrating as it may be to not have a job, it can in some ways be even more spiritually demoralizing to spend one's productive youth trapped in an occupation that is, by almost any measure, a pointless endeavor. American society is in tatters, and from millennials to baby boomers, Americans find themselves staring in dismay at the crumbling infrastructure, the rampant obesity, the shameless degeneracy, the increasing incivility, the political divide, and the breakdown of the family that surrounds them. They are seeking any port in a storm, yet finding nothing. If the cultural bugaboo of youth in the 1950s was conformity, the hobgoblin of 2018 is identity. Whereas iconoclastic wanderers like Jack Kerouac and the Beats sought to break the system, today's millennials just want to find a system that is capable of working for them. The rise of identity politics and the chaotic fracturing of old alliances it involves can be attributed in part to this. People are desperate to belong, and since diversity has destroyed the old cultural bonds of community, school, church, and office, since divorce has broken the family, since the boomers have finally shattered the system, individuals now have little choice but to find meaning and build bonds with others based on shared personal identities, however artificial they might be. But group identity isn't quite as inclusive anymore as it used to be. In the past, straight white young women would naturally congregate within the traditional cultural system, either as stay-in-the-neighborhood moms or possibly in the college system while working on a Mrs. degree. Straight white young men would work alongside their kind, typically with some naturally occurring mentorship built in. There was no consciousness that such natural congregations could possibly be racist, any more than a trans-curious asexual organism today would consider herself to be sexist or normophobic just for showing up at a campus LGBTQ meeting. But as the social system became more diverse, it naturally continued to fracture. In the name of inclusiveness, immigration, and open borders, the system invited conflict and cultural war. And one of the most effective weapons in this uncivil war is to silence other groups and other identities before they have the chance to speak. In other words, you aren't allowed to criticize the state of the culture today without being instantly stamped with one of the three unholy identities: racist, sexist, homophobic. If you say something, anything, that allows someone to mark you with one, two, or even all three of those damnable offenses, then you will find yourself outed once and for all. Nothing you can say will ever be viewed outside the shadow of your single, right-wing, fanatical thought crime. And the internet is forever. Being a game designer, I often view reality through the lens of a computer game. Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis offers a modicum of intellectual justification for this perspective, but let's face it, it's a useful metaphor regardless. And there are times when the modern world feels like a live-action version of the game Portal, in which the environment is designed to kill you. However, unlike Portal, in the real world there is not a slowly disintegrating AI attempting to help you out. It's chaos out there, and you more or less have to find your way on your own. Enter Jordan B. Peterson, the thoughtful, deeply caring, avuncular professor from Canada, offers a voice of apparent reason to young people, especially young men, who feel themselves to be lost and in desperate need of direction. He speaks in a careful and intelligent manner in his videos, and he dispenses simple, innocuous wisdom in an unobjectionable manner, asserting some basic truths that, in an age of lies and mandatory self-deception, are received as if they were manna from heaven by his listeners. The popularity of his ubiquitous video lectures fed the near unprecedented demand for his second book, 12 Rules for Life, which promises its readers a much-needed antidote to the chaos that he tells them fills their lives. It is a remarkable thing that basic advice on how to behave as an adult, such as stand up straight with your shoulders back, should be mistaken for a powerful, revolutionary response to societal chaos. But the truth is, There are many people who are so browbeaten by the ever-shifting rules of the ongoing cultural warfare that even simple childhood directives can be readily mistaken for the timeless wisdom of a true sage. And if a handful of simple, helpful truisms intended to help normal individuals survive an average day were the only message of 12 Rules for Life, one could hardly object to it. But that is not the case. Contrary to what the average reader assumes, the 12 Rules as written are not the primary message of Peterson's bestseller. In fact, the 12 Rules, taken at face value, are not even relevant aspects of the real instructions hidden beneath them. Each rule is both a metaphor and a mask. And Jordan Peterson, like the homicidal GLaDOS of Portal, insists that he is only here to help. Because, encoded within the simple intellectual bait of the 12 Rules is an insidious spiritual poison, and one of the purposes of this book is to help you identify and recognize it. Depending on your level of affinity for Jordan Peterson as a psychologist, a man, a therapist, and a mentor, this may be a difficult pill for you to swallow. But even if you are extremely skeptical of the thesis of this book, remember that even Jordan Peterson himself asks, "Why won't you take your damn pills?" Reading Peterson can be a challenge, and many of his most ardent supporters have not read much, if any, of his published material, opting instead to rely on his vast video library of publicly available lectures, interviews, and personal recordings. So in case you have yet to approach his written work, it will be helpful to know that his so-called antidote to chaos is, like many antidotes, itself composed of poisons. There are 3 different spiritual poisons that feature prominently in the 12 Rules: ignorance, narcissism, and mental illness. Ignorance. Despite his intelligence and his unhesitating self-confidence in publicly addressing nearly any topic about which he is asked, Peterson's words frequently display a remarkable degree of ignorance of the subject upon which he is pontificating. For example, when he elected to weigh in with his thoughts on the nomination and confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court, Peterson ignited a firestorm of indignation among his supporters when he suggested that Justice Kavanaugh step down from the court once his nomination was confirmed by the U.S. Senate, following a bruising confirmation hearing that was dominated by nebulous accusations of criminal sexual assaults that supposedly took place more than 3 decades prior. But one thing that escaped notice amidst the outrage was that in his subsequent non-apology, Peterson made it clear that he believed the position from which he thought Kavanaugh should step down was Chief Justice of the United States, not the open Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States position to which he had actually been nominated. Quote, "It's not a good thing when there is general discomfort with the manner in which something as important as the naming of a new Chief Justice is undertaken. It doesn't bode well for the stability and peace of the state, and perhaps, there is nothing more important to preserve than that." End quote. Jordan Peterson. Notes on my Kavanaugh tweet. The fact that a Canadian was offering unsolicited advice to Americans on the composition of their highest legal institution was bad enough. The fact that he was doing so in obvious ignorance of the actual position involved was incredible, especially when one considers that the Honorable John G. Roberts, Jr. is still the Chief Justice of the United States, as he has been since 2005. Despite the fact that the nomination and confirmation hearings had been in the news for weeks, Peterson didn't even recognize that Judge Kavanaugh was replacing the empty seat on the Supreme Court vacated by the retired Anthony Kennedy, who had served as an Associate Justice since 1988. But Peterson's habit of opining in obvious ignorance is not limited to what he himself describes as the dangerous platform of Twitter and his own blog. He makes similarly egregious errors in the academic citations of his own books. Quote, "It was easier for people to be good at something when more of us lived in small, rural communities. Someone could be homecoming queen. Someone else could be spelling bee champ, math whiz, or basketball star. There were only 1 or 2 mechanics and a couple of teachers. In each of their domains, these local heroes had the opportunity to enjoy the serotonin-fueled confidence of the victor. It may be for that reason that people who were born in small towns are statistically overrepresented among the eminent. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Peterson's citation for the statistical overrepresentation is from an article published by A.T. Poffenberger, The Development of Men of Science, in the Journal of Social Psychology in 1930. This reliance on outdated, 87-year-old social science to retroactively extrapolate assumptions about the current overrepresentation of small-town folk among the eminent is extremely dubious from a scholastic perspective. But that is not even Peterson's worst intellectual crime in this case, because Peterson also incorrectly represents his source. In fact, in his article, Poffenberger states the exact opposite of the conclusion that Peterson ascribes to him. Quote, "The only comparison that can be made safely from this table is between two groups for a given size of birthplace, since we cannot tell what proportion of the population was living in the communities of various sizes. No significant differences appear which would enable us to conclude, e.g., that small towns are more likely than large to foster the production of eminent scientific men." End quote. Poffenberger, 1930. This is very far from the only example of Peterson's habitual ignorance on display throughout the 12 Rules. First, since the facts don't support his argument, it is very convenient that he happened to reverse the original source's conclusions. Second, by relying on an obscure and irrelevant source, his ignorance of the source's actual conclusions are almost certain to go unnoticed by his readers who are attempting to follow his larger point and are unlikely to have access to scientific publications that are nearly a century out of date. Given his customary ignorance, it probably will not surprise the reader to learn that Jordan Peterson began his public series of lectures on the Bible without bothering to read it first. A lecturer in philosophy at the University of St. Andrews, Alexander Douglas, notes that Peterson is similarly ignorant of one of his favorite topics, Marxism. Quote, "That he hasn't read any Marxist literature becomes obvious early on. That he hasn't read any Marx is even more obvious. Let's not pass by the fact that Peterson doesn't know when the Communist Manifesto was written. He says 1880 or 1890, whenever Marx wrote it. Marx and Engels published it in 1848, a year that nobody remotely familiar with modern European history is likely to overlook. Marx was, of course, dead by 1883. End quote. Alexander Douglas, Review of Jordan Peterson's Stupid Lecture. Narcissism. Jordan Peterson's books and lectures are punctuated with a large number of self-referential details, ostensibly in order to illustrate a point he is explicating, but Peterson's reliance upon his personal experiences is often improperly utilized. Time and time again, Peterson presents his own unique life experience as a definitive foundation for the common state of all mankind. There will often be times while reading 12 Rules for Life that you will experience an amount of cognitive dissonance in response to Peterson's autobiographical assertions. Peterson will loftily claim something to be a universal truth for all people for all time, but his assertion will be something that is either not observably true in your own experience or something for which you can readily imagine various circumstances in which that claimed universal truth cannot possibly apply. Quote, "Beauty shames the ugly. Strength shames the weak, death shames the living, and the ideal shames us all. Thus we fear it, resent it, even hate it." End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Quote, "I sloughed off a lot of my past. In a small town, everyone knows who you are. You drag your years behind you like a running dog with tin cans tied to its tail. You can't escape who you have been. Everything wasn't online then, and thank God for that. But it was stored equally indelibly in everyone's spoken and unspoken expectations and memory." End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Quote, "Not all sacrifices are of equal quality. Furthermore, it often appears that sacrifices of apparently high quality are not rewarded with a better future, and it's not clear why. Why isn't God happy? What would have to change to make him so? Those are difficult questions, and everyone asks them all the time, even if they don't notice." End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Quote, I had a notion that confronting what terrified me, what turned my dreams against me, could help me withstand that terrible thing. This idea, granted me by the grace of God, allowed me to believe that I could find what I most wanted, if I could tolerate the truth, if I was willing to follow wherever it led me, if I was willing to devote my life to acting upon what I had discovered, whatever that might be, without reservation, knowing somehow that once started, an aborted attempt would destroy at least my self-respect, at most my sanity and desire to live. I believe now that everyone has this choice in front of them, even when they do not know or refuse to admit it, that everyone makes this choice with every decision and action they take. End quote. Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. Peterson's penchant for autobiographical interpretation crops up repeatedly throughout both of his books. He viewed his experience of growing up in a small town as being something to escape, a limiting condition from which he sought to free himself. But Peterson's perspective is very far from universal. There are plenty of people who grow up in small towns who never experience any of Peterson's oppressive sense of hyper-vigilant oversight. In fact, there are many who view life in a small town as one that is more friendly, safer, and more reassuring than the faceless anonymity of urban life. Peterson's personal perspective is legitimate, but not the way in which he presents it as an unquestioned universal example of the human condition. Peterson even admits as much later when he writes, I thought that every person who moved would have and want the same phoenix-like experience, but that wasn't always the case. Peterson frequently sets up his personal, egocentric experience as a common universal event. It is autobiography as every man, and once you know to look for it, its frequent appearances serve to tell the reader considerably more about the author than about the human condition. Perhaps this is why Peterson uses his ignorance of the facts of small-town living less than 20 pages later in the specious eminent men argument. Peterson grew up in a small town. Peterson is now eminent, perhaps the most famous living clinical psychologist today. His false summary of Poffenberger's research serves as a sort of autobiographical prophecy of Peterson's personal rise to eminence. He justified this approach by an appeal to his intellectual mentor, Carl Jung, in the same letter to his father quoted above. Quote, Carl Jung has suggested that all personal problems are relevant to society because we are all so much alike, and that any sufficiently profound solution to a personal problem may, if communicated, reduce the likelihood of that problem existing in anyone's experience in the future. End quote. Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. Peterson's narcissism means that his rules for life are literally his rules for his own life, not yours and not mine. They are not a reliable guide towards a relevant philosophy for anyone who does not share a significant portion of the unique quirks, foibles, and flaws of a deeply damaged man. Mental illness. Peterson readily acknowledges that he and a number of his family members suffer from significant clinical depression and anxiety. Although he does not name a specific pathological diagnosis regarding his illness, one important clue is his admission to having had a tendency to habitually lie to himself and others at an unusually early age. Quote, I soon came to realize that almost everything I said was untrue. I had motives for saying these things. I wanted to win arguments and gain status and impress people and get what I wanted. I was using language to bend and twist the world into delivering what I thought was necessary. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Peterson gradually grew more aware that his lying had become instinctual over time. Quote, I learned to recognize when I was lying, in fact, by noticing this sinking and division, and then inferring the presence of a lie. It often took me a long time to ferret out the deception. Sometimes I was using words for appearance. Sometimes I was trying to disguise my own true ignorance of the topic at hand. Sometimes I was using the words of others to avoid the responsibility of thinking for myself. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. One is naturally inclined to wonder if Peterson still recognizes his own lies. For example, did he have that sinking feeling when he wrote his non-apology apology for conducting what he called a thought experiment in which he betrayed his own principles and sold out Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh by publicly encouraging Kavanaugh to resign after being confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Did he notice that he was lying? Was he disguising his own true ignorance? Or was he merely using the words of others to avoid responsibility? Peterson exhibits an astonishing predilection for telling tall tales that don't even begin to pass muster. We're reliably informed by the man himself that he never, ever cheats on his diet, not even a little bit, except, of course, for the famous time that he drank a glass of apple cider, now enshrined in internet history as the notorious cider of doom. It's readily apparent that Peterson has not succeeded in kicking his habit of habitual lying. In June 2018, he told Scott Oliver of Vice, "If I had my druthers, I'd rather not be speaking politically at all," end quote. Which flies directly in the face of his youthful campaign for the vice presidency of Canada's Socialist New Democratic Party at the age of 14, to say nothing of his musings concerning a possible run against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau only a month later, in July. Quote, "I won't be happy until I'm elected Prime Minister," end quote. Jordan Peterson, Edmonton Journal, March 14, 1977. What many Peterson fans fail to recognize is that his repeated exhortations to tell the truth are no more indicative of Peterson being inordinately truthful than Google's famous motto of "Don't be evil" means that Google is less inclined to commit evil actions than any other giant, soulless corporation. Just as "don't be evil" takes on a distinctly different meaning when one envisions a wild-eyed, unshaven man stumbling through the night with a knife in his hand muttering, don't be evil," to himself as he eyes a pair of young women waiting at a nearby bus stop, tell the truth, or at least don't lie, takes on a very different meaning when it is uttered by a narcissistic liar. And remember, as I've already shown you, Peterson's rules are, first and foremost, directed at himself. Do you need to remind yourself to not lie on a regular basis? It is only the pathological liar who requires such reminders. Wikipedia informs us that pathological lying is a standalone disorder, as well as a symptom of other disorders such as psychopathy and antisocial, narcissistic, and histrionic personality disorders. Sufferers have also shown above-average verbal skills as opposed to performance abilities, end quote. Is this starting to sound like anyone you know? Mental illness runs in Jordan Peterson's family, which we are informed has suffered from depression for 4 generations. His daughter Michaela has said that she was diagnosed with severe depression and prescribed a very high dose of an SSRI called Cipralex from the age of 12. Peterson himself stated that he takes 2 antidepressants in a 2012 interview. Quote, "I did well on the serotonin reuptake inhibitor alone, but the addition of the Wellbutrin definitely put in something that was missing. When I first started to take it, which in some ways is a momentous decision, especially for someone like me, because I pride myself in some ways on having extremely tight control of my thoughts, for example, and even when I was very depressed, and I've been very depressed, I've never had the cognitive portion of depression. I have a lot of projects on the go, the equivalent probably of 4 full-time jobs." End quote. Jordan Peterson, Depression, a Family Affair. There is also an amount of mental illness in Jordan Peterson's social circle. His childhood friend and former roommate, Chris, spent more than a year living with Peterson and his family, during which time Peterson claims his evil-smelling friend only avoided murdering the entire family because Peterson happened to sense the spirit of Cain had visited our house at 4 a.m. and talked his friend down from what he describes as a murderous rage. Despite Peterson's expert ministrations, 10 years later, at the age of 40, Chris committed suicide in the Canadian bush. In that 2012 interview, Peterson declared that he would never stop taking antidepressants, which, given his self-centered perspective, one tends to suspect is the foundation for the second of the 12 rules, take your pills. However, only 6 years later, Jordan Peterson publicly announced on the Joe Rogan show that he was no longer taking his medication due to the miraculous consequences of his ketogenic diet. He explained that this diet, in addition to curing his lifelong depression and anxiety, had also restored his energy, eliminated his gastric reflux, his snoring, his inability to get up in the mornings, his psoriasis, his gingivitis, the floaters in his right eye, the numbness of his legs, his gum disease, and his mood swings. He is now, he declares, at his intellectual best. He's stronger, and he can even swim better, too. Now, I am not a psychologist. I am not a psychiatrist either. I'm not even an aromatherapist or sandplay therapist. I consider Sigmund Freud to have been a fraud. I think psychotherapy is about as scientifically legitimate as astrology. I have no problem at all believing that antidepressant drugs will seriously mess with your mind and your body. I am not professionally competent to formally diagnose the sanity or the lack thereof of anyone. But if you can't see that Jordan Peterson is a pathological nutcase with a messiah complex and delusions of grandeur, you simply are not paying sufficiently close attention. This isn't going to end well. Chapter 5. Who is the real Jordan Peterson? Quote, I think I've discovered something that no one else has any idea about, and I'm not sure I can do it justice. Its scope is so broad that I can see only parts of it clearly at one time, and it is exceedingly difficult to set down comprehensively in writing. End quote. Dr. Jordan Peterson. Pathological liar or prophet philosopher? Shaman or charlatan? Hoax or healer? Great intellect or grandiose pretender? These are the questions this book intends to conclusively answer for even the most skeptical reader. If you are a fan of Peterson's and you are still standing by your man, I expect that more than a few objections to my assertions about him are likely to have occurred to you. In anticipation of these objections, I have summarized those that are most often made in thousands of critical, often angry, comments and emails that I have been sent by Peterson enthusiasts responding to my various videos and blog posts. Some of them are specious, others are sincere, but regardless, I have responded to them. Objection number 1. Jordan Peterson is a complex thinker with a Platonic approach that is easily misunderstood by those who don't carefully follow him. You just don't understand him. I answer that it is true that Peterson is inclined to excessive wordiness and run-on sentences. His references are often obscure, and the examples he provides are frequently too loosely connected and meandering for the average person to easily follow. But the nebulous word salad Peterson customarily presents in lieu of logical arguments is not at all typical of a genius-level intellect. To the contrary, it is much more commonly observed among academic posers who wish to be mistaken for one. If you have actually read the great thinkers of whom Peterson is almost entirely ignorant, one thing that will often strike you is the intense clarity of their thought processes. Their genius stems from the way in which they enlighten the reader, from the way they turn dark chaos into orderly light. They do not confuse. To the contrary, they clarify. As an exercise, compare the following 4 sentences, all of which are more complex than the norm these days. I ran each of them through the Gunning Fog Index, a weighted average of the number of words per sentence and the number of long words per word. The index provides a number that is supposed to indicate that the text can be understood by someone who left full-time education at a later age than the number. The higher the number, the more complicated the text. But it's really just an objective measure of textual complexity. Quote number 1. We must be able to employ persuasion, just as strict reasoning can be employed, on opposite sides of a question, not in order that we may in practice employ it in both ways, for we must not make people believe what is wrong, but in order that we may see clearly what the facts are, and that, if another man argues unfairly, we on our part may be able to confute him. GFI 31.6. 2. In like manner, the poet, with his words and phrases, may be said to lay on the colors of the several arts, himself understanding their nature only enough to imitate them, and other people, who are as ignorant as he is, and judge only from his words, imagine that if he speaks of cobbling or of military tactics or of anything else, in meter and harmony and rhythm, he speaks very well. Such is the sweet influence which melody and rhythm by nature have. GFI 21.9. 3. The great dramatists and religious thinkers of the world have been able to grasp this fact, at least implicitly, and to transmit it in story and image. Modern analytic thinkers and existential theorists have attempted to abstract these ideas upward into higher consciousness and to present them in logical and purely semantic form. GFI 18.2. 4. We have considered that students in this doctrine have not seldom been hampered by what they have found written by other authors, partly on account of the multiplication of useless questions, articles, and arguments, partly also because those things that are needful for them to know are not taught according to the order of the subject matter, but according as the plan of the book might require, or the occasion of the argument offer, partly, too, because frequent repetition brought weariness and confusion to the minds of readers. GFI 40.2. Were you able to distinguish the Peterson quote from the Aquinas, the Aristotle, and the Plato quotes? If you noticed, the Peterson sentence, which is the third sentence, is considerably shorter and less structurally complex than the other three examples, but it is also observably less clear than them. Whereas the Aristotle sentence is particularly rich with meaning, as it implies a vital distinction between rhetoric and dialectic that many today have trouble grasping, even when it is explained to them in no little detail, but nevertheless clarifies the relevant point for the reader. The Peterson sentence unnecessarily complicates what is a fairly simple and straightforward observation about the mythopoetic human response to the concepts of good and evil. And yes, the GFI on that last sentence was a respectable 36.3, but it wasn't actually that hard to follow or understand, was it? Complexity is neither ambiguity nor nebulosity, and insight does not require complexity. Also, in case you're interested, the authors of the four sentences, in order, were Aristotle, Plato/Socrates, Peterson, and Aquinas. Now, I am no Aristotle or Aquinas, but I do happen to be one of the best-selling political philosophers alive. I was a National Merit finalist, I was a member of Mensa, and I possess an IQ that falls between the third and fourth standard deviations. So if I can't muddle my way through the intricate complexities of Jordan Peterson's philosophy and comprehend its true meaning, how likely is it that you have done so? Are you really certain that you have done so correctly? Please note that I'm not offering myself as an authority in a logically fallacious argumentum ab auctoritate here. I'm merely pointing to the obvious probabilities involved. Furthermore, I have noticed that if you ask 4 different Peterson fans about what he means about any given subject, you usually get 4 different answers, at least 2 of which are intrinsically contradictory, and none of which actually correspond to what Peterson himself says. Here are 4 different takes on Peterson's definition of truth, each of which has been helpfully explained in some detail by a fan. 1. If you're going to go for a definition of truth that JBP subscribes to, one should probably go with the one that JBP mentions, Pragmatism, and the book that he recommends, The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menard. 2. Peterson subscribes to a pragmatist version of the coherence theory of truth. On Peterson's stated theory of truth, an idea can be thought to be true or false at a micro or proximal level, e.g. at the level of a scientific experiment, or at some other level that does not take the morality of the idea into account, yet actually be false or true at a macro or distal level that includes a consideration of whether the idea is pro-survival or anti-survival, i.e. good or evil. For Peterson, it is the macro/distal level, the level that indicates a consideration of the morality of the effects of an idea, that determines the idea's truth or falsity. For Peterson, the standard of the moral truth, i.e. of the goodness of an idea, is that the effect of the using or acting upon an idea is ultimately pro-survival of the individual, or a number of individuals, or all of humanity. 3. Peterson isn't so much ascribing to a coherence theory of truth, it's more a pragmatic form of Nietzsche's perspectivism. Perspectivism would hold that there are no objective metaphysical truths, or if there are, they are completely unknowable, so it doesn't matter anyways. This is a bit rooted in subjective idealism and phenomenology and existentialism, the idea that reality is only the perceptions of human consciousness and does not in any way independently exist. And then you add on the will to power and the human will being the central force in the universe, and it all spirals downhill from there. We are talking about a literal madman here, after all. So on that basis, every will is subject to its own perspectives, its own way of interpreting its perceptions. Therefore, we have no choice but to conclude that no truth is absolute and objective, for any such truth would need to be capable of transcending all limits on perception. 4. My understanding is that Peterson argues that human interaction and agency works through logos and narrative, and so could be considered a separate system from objective, scientific reality. Following from that, he says that the narrative structure is embedded in the psyche, and its archetypes can embody psychological truths that he considers more meaningful than scientific truths. End quote. All of them cannot be right. It's literally impossible. So what does Peterson himself say about the definition of truth in those words that he has very, very carefully selected? Quote, "I don't think facts are necessarily true. So I don't think these scientific facts, even if they're correct from within the domain that they were generated, I don't think that that necessarily makes them true. And I know that I am gerrymandering the definition of truth, but I'm doing that on purpose. Your truth is something only you can tell, based as it is on the unique circumstances of your life." End quote. Dr. Jordan Peterson. In summary, I would suggest that I understand Jordan Peterson very well indeed, especially in light of the direction provided by three great thinkers who are considerably more clear on the subject of truth. Quote, "To say that that which is not, or that which is not, is a falsehood, and to say that that which is, and that which is not, is true." End quote. Aristotle. Quote, "If it be not fitting, do it not. If it be not true, speak it not." End quote. Marcus Aurelius. Quote, "Let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one." End quote. Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Objection number 2. The 12 rules are designed to be a la carte. Just keep what you find useful and discard the rest. I answer that there is a considerable amount of valuable knowledge that originates from a wide variety of people of the most dubious morals. To reject information out of hand on the sole basis of its source is to commit the genetic fallacy. After all, you can almost certainly learn something useful about both architecture and security systems from a burglar. You can certainly discover something useful about propaganda by reading The Dictatorship of the Proletariat and The Renegade Kotsky. Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals are invaluable to those who would understand and resist the tactics of the radical left. Many ex-Scientologists explain that it was the bits of useful advice in L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics that made it so difficult for them to quit, even long after the religion that is built upon those foundations had stopped making sense to them. You can pick out any number of points from 12 rules that seem okay, but the problem with this defense is that the book itself promotes something much bigger and something far more evil than any superficial observation about posture can possibly absolve. Of course, this is clouded by the madness, ignorance, and solipsism evident throughout the book, but underneath it all is a very specific message, a message that would not sell nearly as well if it were expressed clearly from the outset. By the end of this book, the antidote that it provides to the chaos of Jordanetics should make that hidden message obvious. Objection number 3. "You're just jealous of Jordan Peterson's success." I answer that, if you look at Jordan Peterson's life, even by his own account, there is virtually nothing to envy except perhaps his bank account. The man is a clinically depressed, pathological liar who has written all of 2 books, both of which are meandering, incoherent tosses of word salad. I don't even know how many books I've published, something like 15, not including the various comic books, and reviewers of my epic fantasy series, Arts of Dark and Light, usually put it somewhere in between George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. As a writer, yeah, I'll take that. And no father would ever envy what Jordan Peterson has been through with his daughter's various ailments, which have been legitimately horrific since childhood. Envy the man? To the contrary, I pity him tremendously. There is a very good reason why he subscribes to the idea that life is suffering. Suffering and frustrated ambition is virtually all he has ever known. My childhood friend didn't kill himself. I distrust the media and regularly decline interview requests. I have refused every single speaking engagement that has been offered to me for the last 17 years, despite having had no shortage of them as a nationally syndicated columnist. My band, Psychosonic, didn't even go on tour back in the day. The idea of traveling around the world to perform in public for complete strangers is about as close to my idea of hell on earth as it gets. The only venues we played were the Minneapolis clubs we already frequented: First Avenue, 7th Street Entry, the Perimeter, the Living Room, and Glam Slam. If I was jealous of anyone's intellectual success, it would be Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who has far more money than Jordan Peterson, has written more bestsellers, and whose work will last far longer than Jordan Peterson's. Taleb, or Sean McVay, who at 31 is already the head coach of the Los Angeles Rams. I think I would have been a good NFL coach if I'd gone that route. Also, my best-selling computer game sold 6 million units, and Psychosonic recorded 4 Billboard Top 40 club chart hits. I genuinely don't give a quantum of a damn about Jordan Peterson's success, such as it is, and neither jealousy nor envy are the reason I have turned my baleful eye upon the man and his teachings. And finally, for the sake of all the involuntary celibates in the Jordan Peterson fan club, I'll spell out the conclusive evidence as mercifully as possible. Men with pretty wives do not envy men with not pretty wives. Let's just leave it at that. My motivation is perfectly straightforward. The man is a charlatan, and his fans insisted on repeatedly telling me not to believe my lying eyes. Hence, this book. Objection number 4. I am an intelligent person. How could a smart person like me possibly be fooled by the esoteric incoherence of a lunatic? I answer that Jordan Peterson's intellectual con game is less about fooling the casual observer and more about disarming and subtly misleading the intelligent one. It is actually quite easy for people of above-average intelligence to be convinced to place their confidence in those who successfully demonstrate that they are even more intelligent. Peterson presents himself as a thoughtful man of gentle, honest, careful speech. He has a very high level of verbal intelligence, which he utilizes to assemble his carefully constructed matrix of lies and rationalize the bizarre behavioral mechanisms he requires in order to function on a daily basis. He has written his best-selling book for a reader of above-average intelligence, and in doing so has gone to considerable effort in order to conceal his incoherence and his intellectual crimes. The 12 Rules for Life is a murder mystery disguised as a self-help book, and the intended victim is you. In short, an outright fool is far less likely to be taken in by Peterson's 12 rules than the intelligent truth seeker who is smart enough to assume that a book marketed as self-help actually focuses on providing self-help advice and techniques rather than a dangerous reliance upon occult mind control practices. One of the weaknesses of intelligent people is they have a greater ability to rationalize away their instinctive responses to things that don't make sense. But the genuine truth seeker will eventually discover Peterson's habitual deceit because it is woven throughout his philosophy. Although the honest reader may not come to a full understanding of the evil nature of the esotericism that underlies that philosophy, he will inevitably conclude that he has no choice but to turn away from both the man and his works. Objection number 5. He has helped so many people, and he does so much good for the broken, confused young man of today. He even cries for them. I answer that there is no credible metric by which Jordan Peterson can be said to have helped anyone, except perhaps to lighten their wallets. The fact that he sheds crocodile tears while charging unemployed young men $300 to shake his hand is justification for condemning him as a con man, not beautifying him as some sort of living secular saint. In his bio, Peterson claims to have helped over 100,000 people by means of his self-authoring suite, the name of which alone should be sufficient to get your skeptical antennae twitching. Objection number 6. Assuming for the moment that Peterson's rules are deceptive, how does he pull off the alleged scam? I answer that there are a couple of things to consider. First, understand that Peterson divulges, in bits and pieces, some unvarnished truths about himself, but he does not do it in an honest and straightforward manner. By compartmentalizing some of the more untrustworthy aspects of his own nature and by presenting them as examples of normal human failure, he attempts to minimize them. In fact, he's more than a little successful in doing so, as very few of his readers tend to pick up on his self-admitted ugly qualities on their first reading of 12 Rules for Life. Peterson is, by his own admission, a non-confrontational coward by nature. As a child, he felt free to snipe at a friend of his while under the shield of his own father's classroom, but begged, pleaded, and successfully fled the same friend when the friend tried to confront him about it, even though it resulted in the death of the friendship. Quote, I had skipped a grade in school and was, in addition, small for my age. Rene was a big, smart, good-looking kid, and he was tough. We were in grade 6 together in a class taught by my father. Rene was caught chewing gum. Rene, said my father, spit that gum out. You look like a cow. Ha ha, I laughed under my breath. Rene the cow. Rene might have been a cow, but there was nothing wrong with his hearing. Peterson, he said, after school, you're dead. After school, we circled around the bikes, him on one side, me on the other. We were characters in a Keystone Cops short. As long as I kept circling, he couldn't catch me, but my strategy couldn't work forever. I yelled out that I was sorry, but he wasn't mollified. His pride was hurt, and he wanted me to pay. I crouched down and hid behind some bikes, keeping an eye on Rene. Rene, I yelled, I'm sorry I called you a cow. Let's quit fighting. He started to approach me again. Rene, I am sorry I said that, really, and I still want to go to the movie with you. This wasn't just a tactic. I meant it. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. This was not a singular event. When Peterson was a young father, another child abused his own daughter, whose symptoms from a degenerative arthritic condition had already begun to appear. The boy repeatedly stepped, deliberately, on her hands on the monkey bars, yet Peterson could not bring himself to confront the child, and even decades later, resorts to petty fantasy in lieu of action. Quote, she was playing on the monkey bars, hanging in midair. A particularly provocative little monster of about the same age was standing above her, on the same bar she was gripping. I watched him move towards her. Our eyes locked. He slowly and deliberately stepped on her hands, with increasing force, over and over as he stared me down. He knew exactly what he was doing. Up yours, Daddy-O. That was his philosophy. He had already concluded that adults were contemptible and that he could safely defy them. Too bad, then, that he was destined to become one. That was the hopeless future his parents had saddled him with. To his great and salutary shock, I picked him bodily off the playground structure and threw him 30 feet down the field. No, I didn't. I just took my daughter somewhere else, but it would have been better for him if I had. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. There are a number of similar incidents of Peterson's conflict avoidance, including refraining from correcting a toddler after he struck Peterson's child with a heavy toy truck, and failing to address a colleague's psychological and physical negligence of her child who was left in his care. He violates about half his own rules in order to distract a drunken neighbor from shaking him down for money. In pieces, these little stories are designed to illustrate something about the individual rules, but gathered in one place, it becomes far more clear. Peterson is unable to confront people, even when circumstances clearly deem such confrontation appropriate. He condemns this sort of behavior in a powerful way. Quote, "If you flick your 2-year-old with your finger just after he smacks the baby on the head with a wooden block, he will get the connection and be at least somewhat less willing to smack her again in the future. That seems like a good outcome. He certainly won't conclude that he should hit her more, using the flick of his mother's finger as an example. He's not stupid. He's just jealous, impulsive, and not very sophisticated. And how else are you going to protect this younger sibling? If you discipline ineffectively, then the baby will suffer, maybe for years. The bullying will continue because you won't do a damn thing to stop it. You'll avoid the conflict that's necessary to establish peace. You'll turn a blind eye. And then later, when the younger child confronts you, maybe even in adulthood, you'll say, 'I never knew it was like that.' You just didn't want to know, so you didn't. You just rejected the responsibility of discipline and justified it with a continual show of your niceness. Every gingerbread house has a witch inside it that devours children." End quote. 12 Rules for Life. When you put the multiple instances of Peterson's own struggle with lifelong passivity together with his condemnation of passivity, it becomes clear. Most of the 12 rules that he recommends to the reader are actually rules conceived to correct his own personal persistent weaknesses. His strongest arguments tend to be autobiographical attacks on his own failings. Secondly, Peterson is sloppy with his scholarship and citations. He makes broad, sweeping generalizations based off a single citation that actually indicates a more specific purpose. It is easy to gloss over one or two of these citational crimes as mere error, but as they stack up over the course of both 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning, it gradually becomes clear that there is a purposeful pattern behind these errors. Objection number 7. Jordan Peterson is a well-respected academic and an internationally best-selling author who is noted for his brilliant intellect and his common-sense wisdom. How can you possibly suggest that he is some sort of con man or something even worse? I answer that Jordan Peterson is also a complete whack job. He is mentally ill, but he is also intelligent, and his 12-rule path is a method he has developed to help him navigate the complexities of the sane world without abandoning his delusions. He is a high-functioning madman, but he is a madman all the same. A high IQ and the ability to function well in human society, even to succeed in it, is no indicator of sanity. There are convicted serial killers with IQs that made them eligible for membership in Mensa. Ted Bundy even had a degree in psychology from the University of Washington. The troubling relationship of the 12 Rules to dark esoteric literature is impossible for those who are sufficiently familiar with the material to ignore. But even the most casual Peterson acquaintance, whether he has read Peterson's books or not, has been provided with an abundance of clues indicating that something is fundamentally wrong with the man. Quote, "The house had been gutted by Tammy, his wife, and himself, and turned into perhaps the most fascinating and shocking middle-class home I had seen. They had art, some carved masks, and abstract portraits, but they were overwhelmed by a huge collection of socialist realist paintings of Lenin and the early communists commissioned by the USSR. Paintings lionizing the Soviet revolutionary spirit completely filled every single wall, the ceilings, even the bathrooms. The paintings were not there because Jordan had any totalitarian sympathies, but because he wanted to remind himself of something he knew he and everyone would rather forget, that over 100 million people were murdered in the name of utopia. It took getting used to, this semi-haunted house decorated by a delusion that had practically destroyed mankind." End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Dr. Norman Deutsch, page 12. It may be understandable for a man obsessed with preventing the next Holocaust, whose life is dedicated to fighting the historical tyranny represented by communism, to keep some tokens around to remind himself to never forget. But we are told that Peterson's own family home has been transformed into a grotesque fetish altar to communism. The ceilings? Every single wall? Should someone so concerned about oppression really require this level of wallowing in historical propaganda to remind him that it is bad? Of course not. Would a dedicated hunter of serial killers ever decorate his house with the clown portraits of John Wayne Gacy just to remind himself that serial killing is a bad thing? Peterson shares a number of his dreams and visions throughout both 12 Rules for Life and Maps of Meaning. The mere fact of their inclusion should give any Christian reader pause, while the significance that Peterson ascribes to them should trouble every sane reader, regardless of his religious beliefs. Although it is no surprise that a Jungian psychologist would pay attention to his own dreams, the esoteric elements described in these visions can hardly be missed by anyone. Quote, I dreamt one night during this period that I was suspended in midair, clinging to a chandelier, many stories above the ground, directly under the dome of a massive cathedral. The people on the floor below were distant and tiny. There was a great expanse between me and any wall, and even the peak of the dome itself. My dream placed me at the center of being itself, and there was no escape. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Contrary to his usual practice, Peterson helpfully interprets his own dream here, explaining, quote, the center is occupied by the individual. The center is marked by the cross, as X marks the spot. Existence at that cross is suffering and transformation, and that fact, above all, needs to be voluntarily accepted. It is possible to transcend slavish adherence to the group and its doctrines, and simultaneously to avoid the pitfalls of its opposite extreme, nihilism. It is possible, instead, to find sufficient meaning in individual consciousness and experience. End quote. 12 Rules for Life. Peterson's philosophy shares a number of elements with some of history's more notorious spiritualists, including L. Ron Hubbard, Aleister Crowley, and Helena Blavatsky. His 12 Rules for Life rely upon some of their fundamental tenets, although, again, he hides those tenets beneath commonplace metaphors and large quantities of word salad. Over the course of the book, however, you will gradually begin to recognize when he is attempting to sneak one of them past you. But again, you need not be familiar with the terminology of the occult to recognize when you are dealing with a madman. It's hard to describe which is crazier, the following dream that Peterson relates, or the fact that he actually decided to put it down in writing and share it with the world. Quote, I dreamed I saw my maternal grandmother sitting by the bank of a swimming pool, which was also a river. In real life, she had been a victim of Alzheimer's disease and had regressed to a semi-conscious state. In the dream as well, she had lost her capacity for self-control. Her genital region was exposed, dimly. It had the appearance of a thick mat of hair. She was stroking herself, absent-mindedly. She walked over to me, with a handful of pubic hair, compacted into something resembling a large artist's paintbrush. She pushed this at my face. I raised my arm several times to deflect her hand. Finally, unwilling to hurt her or interfere with her any further, I let her have her way. She stroked my face with the brush gently and said, like a child, Isn't it soft? I looked at her ruined face and said, Yes, Grandma, it's soft. End quote. Maps of Meaning, the Architecture of Belief. Grandma is not the only family member about whom Peterson dreams in a distinctly sexual manner. He also dreams about his cousin Diane, who he describes as being the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in waking life. Quote, Some dogs emerged, out from under the basement stairs where they had inexplicably taken residence. They were standing upright on their hind legs. They were thin like greyhounds and had pointed noses. They looked like creatures of ritual, like Anubis from the Egyptian tombs. They were carrying plates in front of them which contained pieces of seared meat. They wanted to trade the meat for the cans. I took a plate. In the center of it was a circular slab of flesh, 4 inches in diameter and 1 inch thick, foully cooked, oily, with a marrow bone in the center of it. Where did it come from? I had a terrible thought. I rushed downstairs to my cousin. The dogs had butchered her and were offering the meat to the survivors of the disaster. End quote. Maps of meaning, the architecture of belief. Forget accepting advice on how to live your life from this lunatic. Jordan Peterson is the creepy relative that all the teenage girls in the family do their best to avoid during the holidays because he stares at them too long. Objection number 8. You claim that Jordan Peterson has been misleading me. How do I know that you aren't the one who is lying about him? I answer that, if there is one thing for which I am known, it is that I do not lie in public or on the internet. I am sometimes misinformed. I sometimes get things wrong. I am certainly aware of Sun Tzu's directive to mislead one's enemies, but I do not deceive my readers, and I do not lie to them. Possibly the greatest compliment that I have ever been paid was by a critic who does not like me and does not agree with my politics. However, after pointing that out, he went on to say, Vox doesn't lie. If he said the sky was green, I wouldn't even bother to look out the window to check. End quote. It's not because I am some paragon of Christian virtue. It's not because I am any more morally upstanding than you are. I'm just as prone to self-serving spin and narrative as the average man, although not to the extent of a pathological liar like Jordan Peterson. It's merely that, as a nationally syndicated columnist, I learned early on that my every word would be carefully scrutinized by my worst enemies, hundreds of them, each looking for some sort of error or inconsistency that could be used against me. I have written 535 columns and over 20,000 blog posts. Prior to my decision to stop granting requests for interviews, I had spent dozens of hours being asked questions by friendly and hostile interviewers. And one of the more common lamentations of the journalists who tried to write hit pieces about me is that I never gave them anything they could use to disqualify or discredit me. The only way to do that is to tell the truth. The only way you can reliably keep your story straight over an extended period of time is to tell the truth each and every time. The only way to avoid spending your days and nights in an agony of anxiety over being found out and exposed is to always tell the truth. Now imagine that you are trying to escape a labyrinth in which you are trapped. You finally arrive at 2 doors. One door is a trap, and it leads to certain death. The other is the exit, and it leads to freedom. In front of each door is a living gargoyle, one which will only tell the truth, and the other will only tell lies. If you ask them which door leads to freedom, then both will reply in the same way, the door behind me. If you ask them which door leads to death, then both will reply, the door behind the other gargoyle. However, there is a question that will reveal the truth to you. If I were to ask the other gargoyle which door leads to freedom, what would he say? If nothing else, this book should provide you with the information required to allow you to determine for yourself whether Jordan Peterson is lying or if I am lying about him.